Welcome to Chapter 4 of Give Me Liberty. This chapter is titled Slavery, Freedom, and the Struggle for Empire to 1763. So this is going to be bringing us relatively close to the Revolutionary War. We'll start talking about that for Chapter 5 next week. But this will be covering the time period that's sort of forming this rebellion, as well as the increased use of enslaved people to make this happen. So we've talked a little bit about why slavery as a model for the workforce, and this has to do with the move from indentured servitude into this chattel slavery model. Again, this would mean that the landowners would not need to pay out either in land or in financial payment to the people after they were finished working, because these people would never be finished working. They were owned by the landowners, and there was no way out of their contract because they didn't have a contract. The indentured servants would eventually get out of their contract after about 5 to 7 years, if they were to survive. What increased at this point was the importation of enslaved people to the Americas. So this is to both North and South America. From 1700 to 1800 is when about half of the 7.7 million enslaved people were brought to North and South America. So within this 100-year period, this is when half of them arrived here. Again, a reminder, the 7.7 million number is the number of people who were taken out of Africa and brought to the Americas. This does not count the continued generations with people having children who were then also enslaved. The enslaved people who were shipped to the Americas to become slaves had often been captured by other tribes within Africa or slave traders within Africa due to warfare or raids or traders looking to make money with the Europeans. They were then sold to European traders who brought them into the New World to sell them. So it's this complicated web of how they got to the port to be sold into slavery, and then how they made it over to what is now the United States and the rest of the Americas. We'd seen this map previously, but I think it's worth pointing out again, so that you have some sort of idea about the spreading out of the enslaved people when they were taken from Africa to the Americas. The Portuguese Empire was the largest purchaser, if you will, of enslaved people at 32%. They brought people mostly to South America, and the British in the Caribbean and the French in the Caribbean needed people for their sugar farming. So these are for sugar plantations. And this was extremely hard work. People needed to be replaced because they kept dying out in the fields. So this is a relatively high number of people needed for this particular spot because the weather and disease and the hard work. You get all the way down to eventually the British colonies, which is about 4% of the enslaved people who were exported out from Africa. So you can imagine how much this has affected our society as now the United States, this concept of chattel slavery and the history of slavery and what it has meant to our country. This is only 4% of the people who were taken from their African homes. Imagine how that might be multiplied in different countries where the history is that they had a lot more of this. This was much more ingrained. It's not to diminish how important it is in the United States. It's obviously extremely important and has defined how we function as a society. It's just some perspective on how this might also be an extremely difficult concept for people to move past in other countries. The Atlantic slave trade is this sort of pseudo triangle that was drawn up between Europe, Africa, and North America. This was the trade of goods and people from these different continents, and they are all intertwined with one another. So they're all feeding into each other. It's sort of the symbiotic relationship. The rough explanation of how this went was that English merchants would travel to Africa to purchase enslaved people. They would then cross the Atlantic with those people in what is called the Middle Passage, and they would bring them to the West Indies. They would bring them to, for the British at least, they were bringing them mostly to the Caribbean and up to what is now the United States. They would bring them across, have them sold out once they reached port, and then the goods that were manufactured by these enslaved people, the raw materials being picked and sort of rough creations being created on these plantations, they would then be sent out to Europe. And in Europe, they often refined the wood and the cotton eventually and the sugar, and they would create products out of them. They would then send these manufactured goods back to the colonies to sell them. So they would send them out into Europe as well, but so far as the Atlantic slave trade, this triangle goes, they would send it back along that edge of the triangle from Europe to the United States, or what is now the United States. This middle passage from Africa over to the Americas is the most infamous leg of this journey. This is when people were packed into ships for efficiency's sake, as they would say. They were packed into ships, taken from Africa, and brought to this new world. They were brought to the Americas. This is obviously called the Middle Passage because it's this middle leg of the journey. So the first leg being from England to Africa to then purchase slaves, and then from Africa to the Americas to then sell the slaves, and then from Americas to back to Europe to bring these resources there to be processed into manufactured goods. About 1/5 of the people who were put onto these ships to go through this Middle Passage died on the journey due to lack of hygiene and the spread of disease, and it was cramped and dirty quarters. There were also instances of people being murdered on these ships by the people who were bringing them, but for the most part, it was death due to disease and lack of hygiene. And people weren't necessarily killing them on board on purpose most of the time because this was their profit, essentially. The people who were in charge of buying and then selling these enslaved people would get a cut of the profits for having shipped them over. The numbers of people who were imported from Africa to what is now the United States is around 500,000, give or take 100,000. So this is that 4% that we were talking about of all the people who were moved over. So you can imagine if 500,000 people were shipped over, this would have a large impact on how the society functioned. We talked about this being a slave society where the economic functions and the social functions relied heavily on this model of slavery. there are lots of different accounts of enslaved people who were translated, I suppose, by Europeans, and things were edited to sound a particular way. The one that's referenced here, Equiano, in your Voices of Freedom book, is an enslaved person's account of their own slavery. It's relatively rare that you have such a detailed account from this time frame, and that's why this one's included in the book. It's why I've assigned it to you. Please be sure to read it. I'm sure you'll find it quite interesting to have a firsthand account of the feelings and thoughts about this whole process from somebody who lived through it. There were 3 distinct systems of slavery once these people arrived to what is now the United States. So if they were to survive this shipment from Africa to what is now the United States, they would be siphoned off into these different categories based on regions. So you have the Chesapeake tobacco system, you have the South Carolina and Georgia rice system, and you have the non-plantation style New England and Middle Colony system. So the first 2 are obviously plantation style farming, which requires a heavy workload. The final one, the non-plantation New England style, is referring to enslavement on a small scale. So it's having less people under your watch, and I don't want to say under your employment because you're not paying them, but under your ownership. All of this is sort of strange language to have to talk about people. The way that we're used to talking about people and their work and their lives is obviously much different from this point, which is why it's important to learn about this so we understand the things that have improved in our society, and the things that we would not want to go back to, obviously, and still to also help us understand countries who are still going through these sorts of changes with their labor systems. It's extremely complicated, as you know, all over the world, but the more information we have about how everyone has done it, and specifically how we've done it here in the United States, this would be helpful for people to make more informed decisions in the future. So between these 3 systems of slavery, each has its own day-to-day realities. They have their own cultural, they have their own cultures, I suppose, and they the work is actually set up differently depending on which system you're working in as well, and that lends itself to different cultural movements within the enslaved people's population and also within the free people's population. Starting with the Chesapeake tobacco system, this would mostly represent places like Virginia, where it would be mostly field work. So you would need field hands, teamsters, which are people who drive horses, boatmen, skilled craftsmen, cooks, seamstresses, personal servants, and dairymaids. So this is sort of what you think about when you think about something like Gone with the Wind, or something in that vein where there are large plantations that lots of different people are working on, and it's sort of this miniature city that people are working in. By 1770, around half of all the families in the Chesapeake tobacco region owned at least one enslaved person. most people didn't have multiple slaves under their purview because they didn't have that much money. And most people didn't have that much land where they would need more than one or two people to help them work their land properly. Only the ultra wealthy class had more than 10, more than a dozen slaves. It became clear within this system that the racial lines were drawn quite heavily. If someone was of African descent, if they were Black, that would be a signifier that they were an enslaved person. And they often equated this with being dangerous. While the indentured servants, once they were freed, often rebelled, as we saw last week, the owners of the enslaved people were worried that the enslaved people might do the same thing. They might rebel, requesting their freedom. So the more that they could paint them as dangerous and fearsome, the more likely it was that laws would fall in their favor, that they would be able to keep the enslaved people under their foot. If enslaved people were indeed freed and became free Black people, like we saw in the pyramid last week, that little sliver of people, this was extremely uncommon, but if they were indeed freed, they were required to leave the colony of Virginia. They thought that staying would encourage rebellion. So this is the same sort of opinion that people had about Native Americans and not wanting to enslave them in the same spot because they felt that they would foment a rebellion. And sending them outside of the colony seemed to separate them from people they knew, and to separate them from the people who had previously been enslaving them. You also have the South Carolina and Georgia rice system of slavery. There were many Native American enslaved people who were sent to the Caribbean, and their goods were still sent to Europe. So the furs and skins and all of those things that they had been trading with the Europeans, that still happened. But when people were captured and sentenced to enslavement, they were sent to the Caribbean again to get further away from people they knew and this ability to rebel. As is the same with the African slave trade, there were also cases of Native Americans, notably the Creek Indians, who sold other Native Americans into slavery. This is an extremely complicated concept, which obviously you could read for years about why people were selling their own people into slavery, because many times they didn't consider the people they were selling into slavery their own people. So this is a sort of Eurocentric view that it would be their own people because they're sort of clumping them in as a giant category rather than looking at the nuanced differences between different tribes and different bands, both in Africa and within Native America. With all of that said, there was a rise at this point in interest in rice in Europe and the colonies. With this rise in interest in this particular product, as we saw with the tobacco system, there was a need for more labor. And this also led to importation of African slaves. By the 1730s, about 2/3 of the South Carolina population was Black, meaning only 1/3 was white. Most of the Native Americans had already been moved out at this point, or they weren't counting them for the most part. So this 2/3 of the South Carolina population being Black meant that they outnumbered the European white population. And that went a couple of different ways. Eventually, this meant that the enslaved people felt that they may have the upper hand should they decide to rebel. And on the other side of that is the European colonizers believing that same thing, basically, that the large population of enslaved African people would mean that they could easily take over. And the European white colonizers made sure to instill fear in people that this was a possibility and that the laws needed to become stricter around enslavement so that this sort of rebellion couldn't happen. One thing that was different about this system than the previous tobacco system that we were talking about was that there was the option for the task labor system. And this system worked in a way that the enslaved person would be assigned a task for the day, and whenever they were done with that, they could be done for the day and have time for themselves. So they could farm their own land, they could build their own homes, they could essentially have free time so long as they had completed the task that they were assigned to complete. So whether it took them 2 hours or 10 hours was sort of up to however they were able to work and get this done. That did leave many people feeling that they had some sort of freedom, but oftentimes people were exhausted. This was extremely hard work, and they didn't necessarily have the energy or the money to do the things that they hoped they would be able to do. The New England system is even probably more different than either of the other two. This one stands out a little bit because it's not a plantation system. Slavery was less important as a concept and as a societal structure in New England because it was mostly small family farms, and the families could take care of it themselves, by and large. When there were enslaved people in the New England colonies, they were often farm hands, artisans, stevedores, which are people who work in shipyards and load and unload ships, and servants. So basically, there was more money to be had within the New England colonies, and this meant that even enslaved people would have more esteemed jobs like artisans and servants within the home. It's not to say that these were particularly great jobs because remember, we're still talking about slavery and we're still talking about being unpaid. We're still talking about people controlling your personal life and with no idea that this would end at any point. In the North, in New England specifically, the laws regarding slaves tended to be a little less restrictive because they were seen as far less of a threat. They were by far the minority population in New England, and that's quite different from what we just said about South Carolina that had a 2/3 population of enslaved people. The laws by the European opinion didn't need to be as strict because they just didn't see a mass rebellion as a feasible possibility. Slave marriage was legal within the New England system, Physical punishment was prohibited. Enslaved people could actually testify in court, which often wasn't the case outside of New England colonies. They could sometimes own their own property, and if they did, they could pass it on to their children. So the New England system, while still participating in slavery, while still being this wretched concept of ripping freedom away from people, you can see this is a different system from that in the South. It obviously does not make it right or excuse it at all. It's simply different. Within the enslaved people's population, you have these different cultures arising out of this mixture of different African cultures being mixed with European cultures. There were many different languages and religious traditions amongst those who were taken from Africa. And it meant that oftentimes on the Middle Passage that we talked about, this middle leg of the Atlantic slave trade, people may not be able to communicate with each other on board or once they arrive within the Americas. They often spoke different languages, were from different parts of Africa, and eventually what this boiled down to was they found a lot of similarities between their cultures, with religion at the forefront of this. And they were able to sort of blend African traditions in with European elements and make new American ways of being. And this depended on region, obviously. There were going to be more people within the South that were being enslaved, and that means more people in the pool creating this particular culture. Whereas in New England, it was often the case that enslaved people would mostly blend with the European elements because that was most of the people they were interacting with. Religion was a huge player in this enslaved people's culture, with Christianity as at the center of it. Christianity purported that there was a single creator God, and this meshed with a lot of what people had come with from the African nations. Also, this idea that nature had a spiritual element and that deceased relatives remained a part of the daily life and could be consulted with. These are things that were transferred from the African nations over to the Americas. And they blended all of this together to create an enslaved person's culture. Field workers often had more autonomy than the house servants, and with this separation between the European cultures and the African cultures, the African heritage remained much stronger for those who had less contact with Europeans, meaning that they were able to sort of blend their own African elements from all these different places and all these different languages, and it had a much stronger influence on their life, their daily participation and their spirituality, while those who worked within the home often moved much more like the New England enslaved person system, in that they would become more and more like the Europeans because that's who they were interacting with. There were many instances of rebellion and many different forms of rebellion that come up, and we'll keep going over these as the weeks go on. One very popular form of rebellion was running away from one's captor. So you have your Voices of Freedom book, and while this particular piece is not assigned to you technically. It may be of interest to you. It's advertisements for runaway slaves and servants from a 1738 newspaper. And basically, you can see in the bottom photograph here, people were giving descriptions of the enslaved people who had run away, because obviously there are no photographs at this point that they could have put in the paper. But you would hear things describing their physical stature, describing their age, describing what they were wearing, where they were coming from, and who was the legal owner of this person, and how they could return them. There were other forms of rebellion. While running away was an extremely popular one because it didn't take a massive group effort. You could escape by yourself and attempt to run away. Again, with race being a marker for the slave system, it was often hard to escape and sort of blend in with people, because if you had black skin, you would be noted as a person who was likely enslaved. And then people would go and check these runaway slave advertisements and attempt to match people up. The Stono Rebellion is another form of rebellion where people came together as a group rather than individuals running away. So in 1739, there were South Carolina slaves who armed themselves by taking over an arms store. They were not allowed to own weapons at this point under colonial law in South Carolina. And so they had to go get some. They went to this armory, and then they marched towards Florida, burning towns and killing residents along the way. The reason that they wanted to make it to Florida was because the Spanish territories offered freedom if people could arrive in the Spanish territories. So this is sort of the flip side. We talked about the Black Legend before, and at this point, the Spanish were offering freedom should they make it to their territory. Most of this group of the enslaved people who were marching were stopped. Most of these rebellions were not particularly successful, but a group of white militia met up with them, and about half of the 60 people who were marching were killed, and the other half were arrested and executed. There are reminder plaques for these sorts of things throughout the United States, because it's attempting to remember this historical wrong that was done and the attempts of people to rebel against this system. It's not as if everyone was just sitting by idly accepting this. Even those who did not choose to rebel were obviously personally disturbed by their situation. The concept of liberty is going to come up over and over again. It's obvious that there is a strong level of hypocrisy here between people seeking freedom, seeking liberty, thinking about what all of this means, while simultaneously enslaving people. The Brits were essentially obsessed with the idea of liberty, and every political issue that they talked about was closely tied to that, and closely tied in with the English common law, or the rights of the Englishman. It's clear throughout the writings that people wrote up, mostly the white men who were in government, that this was not even close to a universal idea. Women were excluded and non-white men were excluded from this. And oftentimes, white men who were simply not wealthy were also excluded from this. But they were the first to see this sort of expansion of rights within the colonies. We have a couple of different terms here which you're familiar with, but are a little bit different from what you might be familiar with at this point. So republicanism with this lowercase r, not talking about the political party, was this idea that active participation in public life by economically independent citizens would mean that there was a solid society. And the economically independent citizens refers to not enslaved people, and also not women, because they weren't economically independent at this point. They relied on either their fathers or their husbands to deal with the financial aspect of their lives. Property owning men essentially were considered virtuous and able to participate in this public political life. Liberalism, again, not necessarily the same concept that we're used to today, but at this point, what liberalism meant was that the individual and private rights were important. So you have this republicanism, which is sort of this idea that there would be for the greater good, and liberalism, meaning that the individuals who might be oppressed in this greater good also needed their rights looked at. And another concept that was extremely important within liberalism is that the consent of the government and the right to overthrow a government that has overstepped its bounds was extremely important. It seems like sometimes this inspection of history can lead to this sort of hopelessness that things were extremely bad and things are oftentimes still considered not that great by a lot of people. So if you're feeling a little depressed about the information that we've been going over, I thought I'd throw in a cat for you. Here's a cat. I can't change the history that has happened, and we're often going to be going over sort of the more complicated concepts, which can sometimes have a negative feel, but this is what happened, and these are the reasons we're going over it, so you can have a fuller picture to add into what you've already been taught throughout your history courses. With all that said, here's your cat meme, and we're talking about voting on this page, so it goes quite nicely together. So voting at this point, pre-American Revolution, was often based on property ownership. This, without sounding too obvious, keeps out women, enslaved people, indentured servants, and the poor. Women were not allowed to own property by themselves. Enslaved people, obviously, were not allowed to own property by themselves either. Indentured servants, if they were still under their contract, they would not be able to vote or own property. And those who had financial difficulty and could not own property were also left out of the voting process. What they did manage to do within the colonies was expand the ability of people to vote, even with all those restrictions. So in England, only about 5% of men could vote. And in what is now the United States, it was about 50 to 80% of the white men in America could vote. This is obviously a big step forward, and we should acknowledge steps forward where they come, even if we'd prefer that they also applied to the groups of people who were left out. So this is a step forward from what people had been experiencing back in England. Free black men sometimes had the right to vote, in a few different colonies, but it was revoked before too long and stayed that way, as we know, effectively until the middle of the 20th century. Another group that was unable to vote were Native Americans. So Native Americans did not have the option of becoming U.S. citizens until the 20th century, until 1924. So we're not going to run up against a time frame in this course this semester where Native Americans were allowed to be U.S. citizens. Voting is one thing. Running for office was a completely different thing. In order to run for office within the colonies, you often had to own large swaths of land and be quite wealthy. We are aware that you often have to be quite wealthy today to run for office as well, but this was a base requirement at this point, and the idea was that you would have some sort of business acumen and care about what would happen in the country, because your livelihood would depend on that as well. It's not a good excuse, but it is the excuse that was given. So far as public involvement in government goes, we talked about people being able to vote. Some people were able to vote while many others were not. People outside of the group that were able to vote were often discouraged from being involved in public discussions about government issues as well. The regular people living within these colonies, just regular people like all of us, they were interested in the way that the colonies were run. So this does mean enslaved people, indentured servants, women, poor men who were not able to participate were interested in what was happening and how it would affect them. People set up different clubs to discuss political issues and philosophical issues. They also talked about scientific discoveries and literary ideas. Obviously, this is the privilege of certain people who had enough time and enough money to seek out some sort of education on these issues. They would have to be able to read and presumably write in order to discuss these issues with people. With the need to read and write in order to discuss these things, you saw a rise in literacy where 3/4 of white men and 1/3 of white women were able to read prior to the American Revolution. It was illegal in many places to teach an enslaved person how to read and write. So when we do have accounts from enslaved people of their experience, this is because someone went against the law usually to teach people how to read and write. So this is an obvious disadvantage for enslaved people, even if they were to become free, that they would not have access to the same sort of literary privileges that many whites were now experiencing. This rise in literacy led to a rise in newspaper publication, which also led to questions about freedom of the press. People could be easily misled by what they read, as I'm sure you're well aware of. When people sort of have a post go viral before anyone knows if it's true or not, this same sort of thing could happen where a falsehood could be published within the newspaper, and misleading the public was not the best use of this written form. Many people were concerned that it would be used in the wrong way, and with the rise in literacy, more people would be reading this incorrect information. A famous trial at this point that you'll read about in your Voices of Freedom book is the trial of John Peter Zenger. And this is the 1735 trial of a German printer who had moved to New York. And he was tried for seditious libel. Sedition is defined as a crime against the state, and libel is a crime where someone says something critical about another person in a public forum. And so this is criticizing the government in print. He had accused the New York governor of corruption, peddling, and tyranny. And the jury basically had to decide if it was actually libelous, which would mean that it was also seditious at this point, or if he was telling the truth. What they came up with was a non-guilty verdict, meaning they decided that Zenger had told the truth and was not guilty of libel and hence not guilty of sedition. And they also decided that the truth could and should be printed. So even if it was critical, the people reading the newspapers should have access to this information, and they should be able to determine for themselves, based on the facts, how they felt about this particular thing. So you'll read about that in the Voices of Freedom. It's sort of this dialogue from the court records. And I'm sure you'll find it interesting. We have concerns about freedom of speech all throughout American history, and our current time period is no different. With regard to religion at this point, another large kind of looming subject that will keep coming up over and over again every week, the Enlightenment had sort of come throughout Europe, in the world really, as a response to the mass amounts of religious violence that had taken place in the 1600s. So even if the hub of this was within Europe, the colonies within what is now the United States were extremely tied to the culture within Europe. So they would be taking their cues on intellectual issues, religious issues, and financial issues from their motherland. So from England, in the case of English settlers. There was a turn at this point in the 1700s toward a scientific model to be used in political and social life rather than this religious ideology. And this is where philosophical thought and writing starts to sort of take off as a popular interest. And it's separate from the religious doctrines at the time. So it's more or less this attempt to look at things more scientifically and consider what all of these things mean, all of these existential issues, what they mean without turning to any of the established religions. In response to this movement, you have the Great Awakening. And this is beginning in the 1730s as a reaction to this Enlightenment movement. And there were roaming preachers who would go around the different colonies and profess that what people needed was this more personal and emotional Christianity. They didn't need this scientific inspection of their life and of the world and of the universe. What they needed was a stronger religious sense. And it wasn't just within the colonies, it was a transatlantic movement, meaning it happened both in Europe and the colonies. And what came along with this was this new style of preaching. So this is where we get the term evangelists. They were bearers of good news about this religion that they were in favor of. And this fed into the evangelical movement in what is now the United States. So this is sort of the beginning of that in this part of the world anyway. And the preaching style moved towards a more emotional preaching rather than preaching in Latin or having this very stilted way of delivering the message. Anti-corruption was a major goal for this movement, both in politics and in business. And the word that keeps coming up over and over again is this concept of worldliness. So what they were concerned about, the evangelists were concerned about at this point, was the greed and financial interest in both politics and business. And it is interesting to note that within this movement, some were willing to criticize the slavery system at this point. We've heard before about Spanish priests criticizing the enslavement of people. For instance, we read about it in the first chapter, where De las Casas was concerned about the treatment of enslaved people and of native people. And this sort of thing comes up over and over again, and this is another instance where a religious group was concerned and took on this abolition ideology. The Spanish and the French at this point didn't have as many settlers in the colonies as did the British. And we talked about that as sort of the concept from the beginning. There was this business idea for the French and sort of this religious conversion idea for the Spanish, as well as a business idea. And the Spanish had a large landmass. You can see that the pink part of this map is referencing Spanish conquest. And it was mostly missions, forts, and military outposts, so it was very sparsely populated. Some had settled in California, where the Native Americans had been killed or moved off, and this also led to the need for laborers, which at this point were often Native Americans. And the French, you can see this middle swath of the light blue or gray, however you see that. They still had this relatively large land mass as well, but it was very sparsely populated by French people. They'd been working with the Native American groups to work within the fur trade industry. And this middle area was the site of many European and Native American violent skirmishes at this point. And you can see the English settlements were the ones in the darker purple. What happened prior to the Revolutionary War here is that you saw what is called the 7 Years' War, or sometimes commonly known as the French and Indian War. And the background for this is that the French and English were fighting in Europe, and this bled into the colonies because the colonies were still deeply connected to the political and social movements within Europe. And when the Ohio Company was given land, the settlers disputed who owned that land. The French said that it was their land, and the British wanted it to be theirs. So people started to fight over this particular patch of land within the middle of the United States. And this war is sort of important for people to note at this point because it permanently changed the balance of power. Things went in favor of the British colonists, even though the British lost at the beginning. The overall war went in favor of the Brits, and eventually they won out. And Canada and the United States were under British control, and Florida was also ceded by Spain to the English in 1763 at the end of this war. This leads directly to the French and American revolutions, and also leads to this concept of pan-Indianism. Pan-Indianism is this idea that these different tribes, different groups of people who are all categorized under this larger umbrella of Native American would join together, even if they had been perceived as enemies prior to this point, because there was a greater enemy that was going to be running them out of their land. You'll read in your Voices of Freedom book a couple different speeches, and you'll see the Native American perspective on this movement with European fighting and Native American fighting as well. The Proclamation of 1763 stated that there would be no European settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains, and this was an attempt to stem off further warfare between the British and the Native Americans. Warfare was expensive, and the home countries in Europe were becoming tired of paying for these. And the payoff of gaining a particular tract of land was not as important as saving the money that it would cost to fight. Another really important part of this war, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, is that it ultimately bonded the British colonists together, regardless of their feelings about the homeland. They were sort of feeling like they'd been attacked by the French and the Native Americans within this very direct process, and they were starting to feel like a group on their own rather than simply an extension of England. So this is a relatively important turning point with this cohesive nature and sort of this idea that the English could continue to encroach upon the continent. There is a video that's referenced at the top of this slide, and I'll post that for you also. It's an overview of the 7 Years' War and why it's important and why we talk about it in history courses. After 1763, so after this proclamation of 1763, you can see this red line that's going throughout the map is where English settlers were not allowed to cross. They weren't supposed to go beyond this line and move any further west, leaving this land at this point mostly for the Native Americans. What this did was not a whole lot. People kept moving over the lines and fighting their own battles rather than having a full-out war at this point. They were just moving out, killing people when they found them, and hoping that they could continue to move and continue to set up new farms and societies beyond this line. The Appalachian Mountains are sort of this great natural barrier, though, so it was only people who were particularly motivated to move beyond this line that did so. So next week you will have, you'll be working on chapter 5, which will be the American Revolution, and we'll talk about the war and what was leading up to it, what it meant, and what it sort of leads to. So this week, you'll obviously have watched this. You will watch the videos that are assigned, and you will read from Voices of Freedom, number 21, 24, and 26. Again, you're free to read all of the other ones in there. Obviously, I encourage you to do so, but these are the ones that are assigned, and you'll submit your assignments based on that. So we will get back in touch next week for Chapter 5.